The tires of Elias's sedan crunched over the gravel of the employee lot at St. Jude's Municipal. It was 10:45 p.m., that stagnant time of night when the world feels like it's holding its breath. The hospital didn't look like a place of healing. It looked like a tombstone made of stained concrete and rusted rebar, looming against the bruised purple of the upstate New York sky. Elias was a traveler. In the nursing world, that meant he was a ghost. He went where the burnout was highest and the funding was lowest. He had spent the last decade running from his own life, moving from one sterile ward to another, never staying long enough to learn the names of the night guards or the favorite flavors of the long-term patients. But as he looked up at the monolithic gray concrete of St. Jude's, his gut twisted. The lobby was a graveyard of orange plastic chairs and flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency that made Elias's teeth ache. Behind the security glass sat Gladys. She looked like she had been carved out of a single piece of dried driftwood, her skin a map of deep-set wrinkles and age spots. She didn't offer a smile. She just slid a clip-on ID badge and a heavy ring of keys through the slot. "Third floor geriatrics," she said, her voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. "They're short-staffed. You'll be solo at the station after midnight. The orderlies stay in the basement unless there's a code. Don't expect them to come up for water or a chat." Elias took the keys, the metal cold against his palm. "Solo? On a geriatric ward? That's a lot of ground for one nurse, Gladys. What if someone falls?" Gladys finally looked up. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, giving her a ghostly, unblinking stare that seemed to look through Elias rather than at him. "The patients on the third don't move much, Elias. They're just waiting. Most of your work is just listening, checking the monitors, making sure the quiet stays quiet." She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface in a small, vanishing circle. "And a word of advice from someone who's been here since the bricks were laid. Stay off the blue line during the transfer hour." Elias looked down at the floor. A thick cerulean stripe was painted onto the linoleum. It was chipped and faded in some places, bright and fresh in others. It started at the front doors and ran straight through the lobby, disappearing into the dark maw of the service elevators. "The transfer hour?" Elias asked, his lip curling into a skeptical half-smile. "Is that when the shift change happens?" 3 to 4 in the morning, Gladys whispered, ignoring his tone. "It's when the body is tired and the soul is loose. The blue line leads to the morgue. It's a guide for the orderlies so they don't get lost in the dark when they're hauling the dead. But at 3 a.m., the line works both ways. Just make sure you aren't standing on it when the guy decides to bring something back." Elias chuckled and shook his head. "I've worked level 1 trauma centers in the city, Gladys. I've seen bodies that shouldn't have been breathing walk out of the ER. A blue line on the floor isn't going to keep me up at night." "It's not the line that keeps you up," she replied, her voice dropping to a low murmur as she turned back to her monitors. "It's what's being dragged along it." Elias stepped into the elevator. The doors groaned shut, and the lift began a slow, shuddering ascent. Every floor it passed emitted a dull thud, vibrating through the soles of his shoes. When the doors finally opened on the 3rd floor, he was hit by a wall of air that felt 10 degrees colder than the lobby. It smelled of heavy bleach, powdered milk, and that sickly sweet aroma of lilies that have been in a vase for a week too long. The smell of a funeral home, trying to mask itself as a clinic. He walked to the nurse's station, a circular desk that sat like an island in the middle of 4 radiating hallways. The blue line ran right past the front of the desk, bisecting the floor like a surgical incision. In the dim emergency lighting, the paint didn't look blue anymore. It looked like a vein of bruised blood under the skin of the floor. He spent the first 2 hours doing his initial rounds, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the polished floors. Room 301, Mrs. Gable. She was 92 and weighed no more than a bird. She was deep in a morphine sleep, her chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged hitches that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. Room 304, Mr. Aris. He was awake, his pale eyes fixed on a television that showed nothing but white noise and static. The flickering gray light made his skin look like ash. When Elias tried to turn the set off to help him sleep, the old man gripped his wrist with surprising skeletal strength. "Don't," Aris hissed, his voice a dry wheeze. "The noise, it hides the sound." Elias gently disengaged the man's hand, noting how cold the skin felt. "It's just an old building, Mr. Aris. It's just the pipes and the wind. You need your rest." "The pipes don't breathe, son," Aris muttered, his gaze snapping back to the static. "And the wind doesn't have feet. Listen to the line, it's thirsty tonight." Elias walked back to the station, rubbing his wrist. He tried to tell himself it was just sundowning, the confusion that hits elderly patients when the sun goes down. But the silence of the hospital was becoming oppressive. It wasn't just a lack of noise, it felt like a physical weight, a pressure in his ears. By 2:30 a.m., Elias felt the exhaustion setting in. He sat at the station, charting by the light of a single desk lamp that flickered occasionally. The rest of the floor was bathed in shifting shadows. Every few minutes, he'd hear the building settle. A groan of wood, a metallic pop from the heating vents. He found himself staring at the blue line. He noticed that near the elevator there were scratches in the floor, long, deep gouges in the linoleum that ran parallel to the blue paint. They looked like fingernail marks. He checked the clock. 2:59 a.m. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the one constant sound in the ward, suddenly cut out. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like being plunged underwater. Elias held his breath, his pen hovering over a chart. He looked down at the blue line. In the total darkness, the line began to glow with a faint, sickly phosphorescence, as if the paint were made of crushed bone. And then from the far end of the east wing, the wing that housed the long-dead patients in the shuttered room in 312, came a sound that made the blood in Elias's veins turn to ice. Thump. It was a heavy, wet sound, not a footfall. It sounded like a slab of raw meat being dropped onto the floor. Drag. Then came the sound of friction. Something heavy, something wet, being pulled slowly and laboriously across the linoleum. Thump. Drag. It was coming from the direction of the morgue elevators. It was moving up the blue line, and it was coming straight for the desk. Elias sat frozen. The pen in his hand felt like it weighed 50 pounds. He didn't want to look up from the charts, but the sound was impossible to ignore. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and agonizingly slow. Thump. Drag. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy, waterlogged rug down the hallway. But rugs don't have weight that makes the floorboards groan. Rugs don't have a heartbeat. Elias reached for the flashlight on the desk. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment he considered just sitting there, in the dark, until the sun came up. But he was a nurse. If a patient had fallen, if Mr. Aris had managed to climb out of bed and was crawling along the floor, he had to help. He had to be a professional. He clicked the light on. The beam was a sharp, aggressive blade of white that cut through the soup of the hallway's darkness. He swung the light toward the east wing. The hallway was empty. The blue line stretched out into the gloom, looking like a dark river. There was no one there. No confused elderly man, no orderly, no one. But as Elias held the light steady, he saw it. About 20 feet down the hall, a patch of the floor was shimmering. He stood up, his legs feeling like they were made of jelly. He walked toward the shimmer, keeping the flashlight beam centered on the blue line. When he reached the spot, he gasped. A trail of water, thick, brackish, and smelling faintly of dead fish and stagnant mud, was smeared across the blue paint. It wasn't just a spill. It was a trail. It looked like something had been pulled through a swamp and then dragged directly over the morgue line. Elias knelt down, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out a finger to touch the liquid, but stopped when he noticed something else. Inside the wet trail were small, jagged pieces of green-black grit. River silt. Suddenly, the elevator at the end of the hall, the service lift used only for moving gurneys to the basement, shuddered. The floor numbers above the door began to glow. B. 1. 2. It stopped at 3. The chime didn't ring. Instead, the door struggled to open, hissing and popping as if something were jamming the tracks. They slid open halfway and stuck. Elias shined his light into the elevator car. It was empty, but the floor of the elevator was flooded with 2 inches of that same dark, muddy water. And there, pressed against the back wall of the elevator, was a single wet handprint. The fingers were unnaturally long, and the print was positioned nearly 7 feet off the ground. Thump drag. The sound erupted from directly behind him. Elias spun around, the flashlight beam whipping through the air. He caught a flash of something gray, something large and slick, vanishing around the corner of the nurse's station. "Who's there?" Elias shouted, his voice cracking and sounding small in the vast, hollow ward. "I have security on the line. Gladys!" He ran back to the desk, his heart ready to burst. He grabbed the desk phone and slammed the receiver to his ear. There was no dial tone, there wasn't even static. There was only the sound of rhythmic wet splashing, as if someone were walking through a deep puddle on the other end of the line. And then a voice broke through the silence of the receiver. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like air being forced through a throat filled with water. "It's so cold." Elias slammed the phone back onto the hook. He backed away from the desk, his eyes darting everywhere. He looked at the floor. The wet trail on the blue line hadn't stopped at the corner. It was moving. As he watched, a new puddle of dark water formed on the floor, 3 feet in front of him. Then another, 2 feet closer. Something was standing right in front of him, invisible to the eye but heavy enough to leave a physical mark on the world. The smell hit him then, a wave of rot so powerful he had to cover his mouth to keep from gagging. It was the smell of a body that had been submerged for a long, long time. He swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam passed through nothing but empty air. Yet the wet footprints continued to appear, stepping around the desk, following the curve of the blue line. Elias backed up until his spine hit the cold glass of the medication cabinet. He watched the invisible weight move past him. The thump drag sound resumed, moving away from him now, heading deeper into the ward. He watched the wet trail, led straight to the door of room 312. The door, which had been shut tight when he did his rounds at midnight, was now standing wide open. The darkness inside the room seemed deeper than the darkness in the hall, like a black hole had opened up in the middle of the hospital. Elias looked at the clock. 3:15 a.m. The transfer hour had only just begun. Elias stood paralyzed against the medication cabinet. His breath came in short, jagged hitches that bloomed like white ghosts in the unnaturally chilled air. He watched the wet, muddy footprints lead into room 312, but nothing came back out. The door remained ajar, a black vertical slit in the gray hallway. He forced himself to move back to the safety of the nurse's station, or the illusion of it. He sat down, his hands trembling so violently He had to tuck them under his thighs. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, on the blue line, waiting for the wet trail to move again. Then the silence was shattered. Buzz. The call console on the desk exploded into life. A red light began to pulse, a rhythmic, frantic blinking that mirrored the panicked beating of Elias's heart. He looked at the digital readout. Room 312. No, Elias whispered, his voice barely a breath. No, no, no. He stared at the light. He knew that room was a skeleton. The bed was nothing but a bare plastic mattress. The oxygen lines were unhooked. The monitors were unplugged. There was no one in that room to press a button. There was nothing in that room with fingers to touch a cord. Buzz. The buzzer was louder this time, a harsh mechanical grating that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of his bones. In the dead silence of the third floor, it sounded like a scream. Elias reached out. His hand hovered over the plastic console. Every instinct he possessed, every survival mechanism honed over years of life, told him to get up and run for the stairs, to leave his coat, his car keys, his career, to just run until the sun came up. But he was a nurse, and beneath the terror, a cold professional curiosity was beginning to harden. If there was someone in 312, some intruder, some prowler, or some patient who had wandered in, he had a duty to answer. He pressed the talk button. The speaker hissed with a burst of static that sounded like dry sand being poured onto a metal sheet. Nurse's station, Elias said, his voice cracking. Who is this? At first, there was only the static. Then the white noise began to shift. It deepened into a rhythmic sound. Zzzt. Elias recoiled. He knew that sound. He had heard it 100 times in the basement of other hospitals. It was the sound of a heavy-duty vinyl zipper being pulled slowly open. Zzzt. Then came the breathing. It wasn't the breath of a living person. It was a wet, congested gargle. It sounded as if someone were trying to inhale through a throat filled with thick, stagnant water and river silt. Each intake of air was a desperate, bubbling struggle. Is someone there? Elias shouted into the intercom, his fear turning into a frantic, defensive anger. This isn't funny. Gladys, if this is you playing a prank on the new guy, I'm reporting this. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Elias held his breath, leaning closer to the speaker. He could hear a faint metallic clicking, the sound of the call button being pressed repeatedly, rapidly, like a telegraph sending a frantic SOS. Then, a voice emerged from the static. It was thin, like the sound of parchment being torn. The water, the voice rasped. It's in the back of my head. Elias felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. Who is this? Give me a name. I can't find the dark, the voice bubbled. Elias, help me. Find the dark. The speaker erupted in a deafening screech of feedback that forced Elias to leap back, knocking his chair over. The red light for room 312 stayed on, solid now, not blinking, constant. He looked at the patient log again, his eyes blurring. He turned the pages back further than his own shift, back 3 weeks. He found the entry for room 312. Patient, John Doe, number 42. Status, deceased. Notes, found in the Black River. Submerged approximately 14 days. Transfer to county morgue delayed due to paperwork error. Elias felt the room spinning. He remembered Gladys's words. The blue line leads to the morgue, but at 3 a.m. the line works both ways. Suddenly the thump drag sound returned, but it wasn't in the hallway. It was coming from the intercom. Thump, slap, drag. The sound of bare, wet feet hitting the linoleum in room 312. Elias watched the hallway through the gap in the nurse's station. He saw the door to 312 swing wide, hitting the interior wall with a dull thud. A shadow stretched out from the room, cast by the moonlight into the hallway. It was a long, distorted shadow of a man, but the head was tilted at an impossible angle, and the limbs moved with a jerky, unnatural stiffness, like a marionette being controlled by someone who didn't understand how joints worked. The shadow stopped at the edge of the blue line. Elias grabbed his flashlight, his knuckles white. He knew he couldn't stay at the desk. If he stayed, he was a sitting duck. He had to go to the door. He had to see it. He had to know if he had finally lost his mind. He stood up and stepped out from behind the desk. As soon as his foot touched the blue line, the temperature in the hallway didn't just drop. It plummeted. His breath turned into a thick fog. He began to walk. Every step felt like he was moving through waist-deep water. Slap! A wet footstep appeared on the floor 10 feet in front of him. Slap! Another one 5 feet closer. The thing from 312 wasn't waiting for him in the room. It was coming back for him. Elias raised his flashlight, his finger trembling on the trigger. He took a deep breath and clicked the beam on, aiming it directly at the space where the footsteps were appearing. "Show yourself," he screamed. The light hit the air, and for a split second the beam refracted off something. A shimmering, translucent outline of a man, slick with river water, standing right in front of him. The intercom at the desk behind him clicked on one last time. The voice was no longer coming from the speaker. It was coming from the empty air 3 inches from Elias's ear. "I'm right here, Elias." The voice in Elias's ear wasn't a sound. It was a vibration that settled into his jaw and echoed in his skull. It smelled of stagnant river mud and the cold, metallic tang of a butcher shop. Elias didn't move. He couldn't. His muscles had locked into a state of tetany, a primal paralysis that happens when the brain simply refuses to process the horror in front of it. He stood on the blue line, his flashlight beam trembling against the far wall, illuminating nothing but dust motes and shadows. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Elias turned his head. The hallway was no longer empty. Standing beside him was a figure that seemed to be woven out of the darkness itself, yet it was slick, shimmering with a foul, dark moisture. It was a man, or it had been once. He was dressed in nothing but a tattered, translucent hospital gown that clung to a bloated gray torso. The skin was the color of a bruised plum, translucent and stretched tight over bone, as if the water inside him was still trying to burst out. But it was the face that tore the air from Elias's lungs. The man had no eyelids. The skin around his eyes had been worn away, leaving raw, pink circles of exposed tissue. 2 bulging, milky white orbs stared out from the gore, unblinking, unmoving, and filled with a frantic, eternal consciousness. They looked like marbles dropped into raw meat. "The fish!" The thing rasped, its jaw unhinging further than a human's should. "The fish and the silt. They took the curtains, Elias. I can't close the windows." Elias found his voice, though it sounded like it belonged to a stranger. "What? What do you want?" The creature stepped closer. Its bare, waterlogged feet made a sickening squelch on the linoleum. It reached out a hand with long, yellowed fingernails and skin that looked like wet, crumpled paper. It placed a finger on Elias's cheek. It was colder than ice. It was a cold that didn't just touch the skin. It reached inside and extinguished the heat in Elias's blood. "I've been watching you all night," the John Doe whispered, the sound like a leak in a pressurized pipe. "I watched you blink. Such a simple thing. A flick of skin, a moment of darkness. Do you know how long it's been since I've seen the dark?" Elias tried to pull away, but his feet were anchored to the blue line. He felt the creature's other hand settle on his shoulder, the weight of it pulling him down, forcing him to look into those horrific, naked eyes. 3 weeks, the thing gargled. 3 weeks of the fluorescent lights, 3 weeks of the moon, 3 weeks of staring at the bottom of the river, watching the silt drift by, never closing, never resting. My brain is on fire, Elias. I just want to sleep. The creature's face leaned in closer until the stench of the black river was all Elias could breathe. You have so much skin, the John Doe murmured. Its fingers moved up from Elias's cheek, hovering just above his left eye. The yellowed fingernail brushed against his lashes. You have 4 of them, 2 on top, 2 on bottom. You don't need them all. You're a nurse. You're supposed to help the suffering. Please, Elias sobbed, tears finally breaking through his paralysis. Please, just go back. Go back to the line. I am the line, the creature hissed. Suddenly the lights of the entire ward flashed, a blinding, strobe-like explosion of white. In that flash, Elias saw the creature clearly. It wasn't just one man. Behind the John Doe, a queue of shadows stretched down the blue line, a line of gray bloated shapes, all of them staring with wide, lidless eyes, all of them waiting their turn. The creature's thumb pressed down on Elias's upper eyelid. It was a heavy, wet pressure. Elias felt the skin begin to stretch, the stitches of his own biology screaming under the strain. Give me the dark, the thing roared. Elias screamed, a sound that shattered the glass of the nurse's station and echoed through the entire decaying hospital. He swung his heavy metal flashlight with every ounce of strength he had left. It connected with the creature's head with a dull, wet thud, like hitting a ripened melon. The creature didn't fall. It dissolved. The figure turned into a torrent of freezing black water that collapsed onto the floor, drenching Elias from head to toe. The smell of the river filled his throat, choking him. He fell to his knees, gasping, clawing at his own face, certain that his eyes had been taken. He stayed there on the floor, shivering and screaming, until the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m. They found him huddled in a ball in the middle of the hallway, his scrub soaked in a foul-smelling liquid that the janitors couldn't identify. His eyes were wide open, his pupils dilated to the size of coins. He wouldn't speak. He wouldn't blink. Elias Thorne never worked as a nurse again. He moved to a small town in the desert, a place where the air was bone dry and there wasn't a river for 100 miles. He lives in a house with no mirrors and no blue paint. He keeps the lights off, living in a self-imposed tomb of shadows. But the silence doesn't help. Every night, exactly at 3 a.m., Elias feels a drop of cold water hit his forehead, then another. He lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, paralyzed by the familiar scent of river mud. He feels the weight on the edge of his mattress. He feels the mattress sink as something heavy and wet climbs up beside him. And then he feels the thumbs. 2 wet, freezing thumbs settle over his eyes. They don't try to pull the skin away anymore. They just stay there pressing down, trying to keep his eyes open. And a voice, thin as parchment and wet as the grave, whispers into his ear. Don't close them, Elias. If you close them, I can't see the world through you, and we have so much more to look at. Elias stares into the dark, his eyes burning, his vision blurring, knowing that for the rest of his life, he will never truly be alone in the dark, because on the 3rd floor of St. Jude's, the blue line never ends, and the John Doe is still waiting for his rest.